So today's session, I'm really pleased to welcome you and introduce you to our speaker, Des. So Des is the implementation head, the lead of implementation as part of the KSS ARC. And it's a really interesting and important topic area because often research gets criticised for not being applied and actually not changing anything on the ground. And so that is Des's remit and Des's team's remit within the ARC. So we are so pleased that he is here, not just speaking to you today, but being part of the ARC. Now, Des has lots of qualifications, but just to briefly say, before he was at the ARC and part of AHSN, he was the medical director at Brighton and Sussex University Hospital NHS Trust. And then he was at SASH as the medical director. And now he's the Chief of Innovations at Surrey and Sussex Healthcare NHS Trust.
So, as Rowena said, my name's Des Holden, and I work principally 4 days a week at Kent, Surrey and Sussex Academic Health Science Network. Now, academic health science networks were created about 7.5 years ago, and there are 15 of them that cover the geography of England. They are the same geographies as the 15 ARCs. And really, over the last couple of years, ARCs and AHSNs have been asked to work together, with the idea being that the experience that AHSNs have over the 7 years of their existence will help ARCs to implement their research findings. Now, it wasn't what we were created to do. What we were created to do was spread innovation. And that was because back in about 2010, there was kind of the latest wave of concern that England and the UK was not short of great ideas for changes in the pathways of healthcare. But from an idea being created through to its implementation took upwards of 10 years. And this was felt not fair to the public. So AHSNs were created to try to drag innovation into practice quicker than what you might call diffusion. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what AHSNs have done in that context of spreading good stuff. And I'm going to talk just to a couple of case studies that I hope will help us all think about what it takes to implement things. I'm going to talk a little bit about co-design because I think, old though I am, I think the journey I've been on is that co-design is an absolute fundamental, and without it, we're really trying to push water uphill. And finally, I'm going to kind of make a bit of a plea that everyone who is doing research or involved with the ARC thinks about how much benefit is gained from pull from the system for the findings of research, rather than anyone, you or me, just trying to push the findings into an unreceptive audience. So that's roughly what I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. So we've been around for 15, we are one of 15 in Kent, Surrey and Sussex, and we've been around for getting on for 8 years now, so we're in our second license. In our first 5-year license, we were asked to do what I've described pretty much as an autonomous 3-county system. For our second license, we've really been asked to work as a national network, which of course is sensible and what we should have been doing in our first 5 years, because that's what allows spread outside of a relatively small area like the Southeast nationally, or vice versa. We get our funding from NHS England and from what was NHS Improvement, and we also get some funding from the Office of Life Science. And all of that makes sense in terms of our aims, which are to increase health and also to increase the wealth of UK PLC. About 30% of our budget is required to be spent nationally on national programmes, leaving about 70% to be spent locally. But again, that is local in terms of what our systems demand of us. I've put local in inverted commas because local may not mean Kent, Surrey and Sussex. It may mean the southeast of England, and NHS England are thinking what that means at the moment. We're about 2 years away from our next license, and already the national network are making the case of why the relatively small amount of investment that AHSNs get is of good value. So we certainly hope to be around for another 5 years of license and continuing to support the ARC going forwards. And we haven't come in as a sort of secondary thought in relation to the ARC. So although Rowena was very involved in the writing of it, the AHSN was also involved in convening meetings, bringing partners together. And I had the honour of being part of the team who was interviewed by NIHR, where we said what we would do if we were licensed. So it's a relatively long-term relationship that is longer than the lifespan of the ARC itself. Next slide, please. I put this slide in because I think it's important that people realise that whilst it's very competitive to get research funding, and it often feels as though there isn't enough money around to do all the very interesting and highly relevant research that could be done, the amount of money that's set aside for the implementation of innovation or research finding is minuscule in comparison. So ARC funding really is to be treasured. Although very little of the ARC funding is eligible to be spent on implementation, at least all the researchers who are doing projects within the ARC know that the outcome of their work needs to feed into implementation. Discovery is not enough in terms of the ARC. So I'm very pleased, as a kind of ex-researcher myself, that there is a funding stream purely designed to see those findings turned into visible results for the public. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is a little bit historic, but it was the best one that I could find. And you can see a kind of red arrow 3/4 of the way down pointing to the left, showing that the things that preceded ARCs, which were clerks, which had a very similar remit to ARCs, are there really spanning the evaluation, adoption, and diffusion processes of seeing invention turned into patient benefit. And you can see that National Institute of Health Research funding goes into quite a lot of different organisations and initiatives that really go from invention right through to adoption. The AHSN comes in there right near the bottom, third up from the bottom, and has this role in relation to innovation, as I was saying. So in a way, we are both small players in the overall effort to drag invention, discovery, and innovation into the pathways of care for the public. Next slide, please. So the AHSN, our AHSN, reinvented itself a couple of years ago because we were concerned that we were quite successful in bringing innovation into care pathways, but we felt that it was possible that we were adding more to the people who are already experiencing good healthcare. So innovation could potentially be widening the gap between those who navigate healthcare well and those who get left behind. So we took a board decision that we wanted to make sure that the innovation that we were spreading was reaching as many people as possible, and very specifically that we would look for the people who traditionally were less heard from, the people who didn't benefit from the best that health and social care had to offer, and try to understand what it would take to get them to receive the benefits as well. Next slide, please. Now, we have a way of working in the AHSN, which is called an innovation exchange, and it has these 4 basic building blocks. So it starts with needs articulation. So we don't believe that we should be pushing innovation or pushing the products of industry without understanding exactly what they're trying to address. What is the need within the public or within the front line of care that a potential innovation is going to address? So need comes first. Then we look for the solutions that may play against that need, which is the signposting and matchmaking, usually with industry, sometimes with innovators within health and social care, and increasingly, because of the ARC, with academics. when we have some deployment of those interesting innovations, then we're well set up to evaluate those innovations in practice. So often that might be at a GP practice level, or it might be at a hospital level, but increasingly it might be at a place or an ICS level. And where we see the benefits that those innovations have, then we are set up to spread those benefits into neighbouring systems. That's how we work. Next slide, please. I should really have put these two slides the other way around, but our programme traditionally has been very focused on physical health and has been very focused on secondary care. And some of the case studies I'm going to show you will show that. So at the same time that we were deciding that we needed to reach people that innovation potentially wasn't reaching, we also decided we needed to be much more consciously involved with primary care, with mental health, and also with social care. Thank you. Next slide. So I put this slide up really just to show that we have quite a long track record of delivering not just innovation at a practice or a pathway level, but really in terms of publications and in terms of making a difference regionally and nationally. Next slide, please. So in 2013, when AHSNs were being set up, interestingly, in Kent, Surrey and Sussex, most of Kent wanted to be part of King's Health Partners, and the west of Surrey wanted to be part of Wessex. And I and others went on a bit of a roadshow around Kent, Surrey and Sussex and pointed out that we had a very successful improvement programme that had been running for about 3 years, which was based solely on all the providers within Kent, Surrey and Sussex. Now, this was a programme that looked at some basic pathways of patients ending up being admitted into hospital with relatively common conditions, such as heart failure, such as pneumonia, such as fractured hip. And what we were able to do was use something called a care bundle approach, which was a little list of best practice interventions. And we were able to convince hospitals in particular to collect the data in relation to the diagnosis and understand whether they were delivering each of the interventions within a care bundle. So quarter by quarter, all of the hospitals in Kent, Surrey and Sussex submitted data on, let's say, every patient admitted with pneumonia. And we were able to look and see whether they'd had a blood culture taken, whether they'd had a chest x-ray, whether they'd had antibiotics within 2 hours of admission. And we were able to reflect that data back to the hospitals. We were able to reflect it back to hospital boards. And we were able to show how each hospital was doing and how each hospital was doing compared to all the other hospitals in Kent, Surrey and Sussex. And for the first 9 months or so, we anonymised all the hospitals in the data that we were showing. But after that, we began to de-anonymise, name the hospitals. Now, this was a very successful programme. And for all of the interventions, we were able to see a rapid increase in improvement in patients getting every single element of the care bundle. And I think it's important to understand why that was. Now, we talked to hospitals extensively at the time, and the things that seemed to make a difference, number one was, at the time, hospitals could claim a payment. So hospitals were top sliced financially, and money was held back, which could only be won by the hospitals if they demonstrated quality improvement. So we were able to use this mechanism to enable hospitals to win back their what's called sequin money. So there was a financial incentive for hospitals to take part, and that meant that all hospitals did take part. I put that as number one. I think number two was hospitals tend to be competitive. So hospitals want to be as good as they can be on metrics where hospitals can be compared. So we created, if you like, a comparison between hospitals in relation to very common emergency admission diagnoses. And hospitals wanted to show that they were improving, and hospitals wanted to show where they were best. So I think those were the two important things that led to very good engagement from the hospitals. And without the flow of data, we wouldn't have been able to present the findings, and we wouldn't have been able to galvanize that improvement for patients. Next slide, please. So another program that we developed locally in Kent, Surrey and Sussex was around something called emergency laparotomy. Now, an emergency laparotomy is when someone is admitted as an emergency and they require their abdomen to be opened up surgically and something done, usually because something is either blocked or has burst. Now, this has got a very high mortality rate, and therefore, again, we developed, mostly with colleagues at the Royal Surrey County Hospital, a care bundle of interventions such as consultant surgeon involved, certain kinds of anaesthetic, certain kinds of very active management immediately post-op. And we could demonstrate initially in one hospital, or the hospital itself could demonstrate, that if you did all these things, the survival advantage for patients was significant. So we were able to take that program, spread it across Kent, Surrey and Sussex. So another national program that was not invented in Kent, Surrey and Sussex, but it came, I think, from Wessex, but again is a national program, looks at giving GP practices an IT platform that looks for dangerous or perhaps unhelpful drug combinations that patients within the practice are being prescribed. So this again, if a patient is receiving dangerous combinations of drugs or drugs that interact with each other negatively or drugs that compound each other's effect so that you're getting an above expected and above desirable effect of the drugs, then those things can be detrimental to the health of patients. And that detriment can lead to admission or it can lead to morbidity or mortality. So this was an important national program. And again, I put this slide in just to show that with time, we are able to drive the uptake of a change of practice that has a benefit for patients. And the important thing about this program is there was no financial incentive for hospitals or for GP practice. So this was achieved through persuasion. Next slide, please. And this is a similar, again, national program, again, I think coming from Wessex, which is to make sure that when a patient is discharged from hospital, their GP practice know the medications that they've been discharged on. Now, people in the audience may think that's an absolute no-brainer and you would just expect that to happen. However, it is an area that carries quite a degree of risk for patients. So this program was designed to make sure that it happened. And again, the uptake across the country and locally in Kent, Surrey and Sussex has been very good. You can see that over the lifetime of the program, about half of the trusts in England have now taken on this way of working that ensures good communication around pharmaceutical intervention for patients with primary care. So you can see that that's about 50%. You might think it should be higher. I'd like to think it was higher. Now, both of these programs, PINSA and TIHM, are programs that we in Kent, Surrey and Sussex have looked at to see whether we can show any difference in uptake against the sort of groupings of people who we might expect to do better or less well from innovation. So by looking at postcodes and looking at indices of multiple deprivation, we can show that GPs and hospitals have taken up these interventions irrespective of the degree of disadvantage that their communities face. So we have yet to be able to do this on other protected characteristics, but when looking at indices of multiple deprivation, you are just as likely to benefit or not benefit from these interventions, whether you're at the worst end of the index of multiple deprivation or the best end. Next slide, please. So I'm going to harp on a little bit about needs articulation. So I believe that innovation is best deployed and pulled into practice if it is very closely addressing a specific need that is evident at the front line. So this is the opposite of just trying to push an innovation. This is about understanding with great granularity exactly what the need is, and then trying to find the innovations and the answers which will fill that need. Now, my view is that this is just as important within the ARC and the research that the ARC is doing. The ARC must be doing research that is relevant to the front line, relevant to the needs of the public, relevant to the givers of health and social care, or it will be difficult to push seemingly unrelated solutions into the front line. Rowena was kindly introducing me as a sort of ex-medical director of acute trusts. I have 10 years of experience of being a medical director of acute trusts. And I can tell you honestly that no matter how well you think you know how services are being delivered, sitting around a board table or sitting around an executive table, it is absolutely no substitute for being at the front line, talking to staff, talking to patients who have those needs. Next slide, please. Now, the easiest way, perhaps, to do that is to have places that you can go to ask people about their needs. So I put this slide up because some of the absolute happiest times I've had have been in the ground floor of Leach Court in Brighton, where a community of about, I think it's about 150 living units within Leach Court, but don't quote me on that. Many of the residents have agreed to meet with researchers, meet with innovators, meet with improvers, and give them the benefit of their experience in relation to any and all questions. So there was a Darcy Fellow working probably about 3 years ago in Leach Court on diabetes, and he was able to talk to people not in the context of his clinic, where that hierarchical relationship is bound to exist, but just go to people in their living area and meet with them around a table and try and understand some of the barriers, some of the needs that people who live with diabetes experienced. And out of that came some very interesting questions that he was able to go away and begin to answer. Next slide, please. Now, easy to see where some things need improving. More difficult, perhaps, to see where they need improving in a well-run service, or a well-run service that an executive doesn't have any concerns about. So I had a Darcy Fellow about 5 years ago called Bonnie Koo, a pharmacist, and she wanted to see if there was any room for improvement in one of our best-run services at Surrey and Sussex Healthcare. So she went to a respiratory clinic and formed a kind of community of experience within the outpatients of that respiratory clinic. We were a bit concerned about governance, so we asked the Director of Corporate Affairs of the hospital to oversee it, which she agreed to do. This was a group of patients who were attending a clinic that was very well regarded and had very good scores on a kind of would you recommend us to family and friends questionnaire that pretty much everyone who attends a hospital these days is asked to fill in. But what emerged in that service was, with some prompting, was that patients felt talked to rather than talked with. And what they wanted was very motivated doctors and nurses to spend some time talking to their partner, who often bore much of the needs of kind of day-to-day management of their condition. And they also wanted advice from peers. So they felt that they had a lot to gain facing individual personal challenges from people who had faced similar challenges themselves, rather than people who'd learned about them. So as a consequence of that, in an apparently well-run clinic, we enabled them to set up a peer support for each other and for the partners and carers of people, which was something we would never have thought of doing in that clinic, about which we had no concerns. Next slide, please. So I said I would talk a little bit about co-design. I sort of really learned about co-design firstly as an obstetrician many years ago, when it was easy to get representation from some sections of pregnant women and very difficult to get representation from some other groups, particularly, for instance, teenage mums. Following that, I went to southern Denmark, and in southern Denmark, they had a very thriving company called Public Intelligence, who were commissioned by the local municipality to help with innovation. And they developed a methodology which was around core labs. So this is something the AHSN is trying to do at the moment in Surrey. So a core lab is a group of system leaders who set an improvement challenge and have some budget to enable it. The principle is that once the challenge has been set, you use trusted users, people who are willing to look at new solutions to the problems that they are living with, pilot them. And the idea is that those things that don't meet the needs of those trusted users get taken no further. And those things that do meet the needs of trusted users can be spread sequentially into more homes and analysed. And that gives you a platform from which to have legitimacy in spreading that innovation. Next slide, please. So the first time that we used this methodology and we invited some of Public Intelligence over was 5 or 6 years ago now. And there was a hypothesis at the time in Surrey, from Surrey and Borders Partnership Trust, that people with dementia, if they were admitted into hospital, would stay twice as long on average as someone without dementia. So there was deemed to be a health advantage and an economic advantage if people could be kept in their own homes longer and not admitted to hospital. So the idea was that if you could diagnose people early with problems that might, if left alone, result in admission to hospital, then you could intervene earlier and keep them at home. So the idea was to put technology into people's homes to physiologically monitor heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and things like how often people went to the toilet, because with a urinary tract infection, you will tend to go to the toilet more often. Whether patterns of behaviour were changing, like if the fridge was never opened at night because people weren't having a drink at night, did they start to feel thirsty at night because they were peeing more during the day? So that was the hypothesis. And we used this methodology of trusted users. And the trusted users came along and they played with various bits of the technology. And the technology that they found unacceptable was ditched. And the technology they found acceptable was taken forward into the program. And this was a program funded by Innovate UK, and the initial funding was £5 million. Next slide, please. So these are real pictures. The bottom two pictures are a little space at the end of a corridor within the 5G building at the University of Surrey that were mocked up to look a little bit like a stylised living room and a stylised bedroom, which you can't quite see on there. And then we asked people, some of our trusted users, to come along and use various bits of the technology and assess them. And from that, we then asked them to pilot it in their own homes. Next slide, please. And this, as I said, was a pretty successful way of working. And we got some really good insights into technology. So the biggest concern that people had was that they might break the technology, and they were worried about breaking somebody else's technology. The second biggest concern they had was if something had a little flashing light to show that it was working. In general, people didn't like that. In general, they felt it was some sort of covert filming or something that they didn't understand within the context of the system. So we went initially from about 22 technologies down to about 6 and ultimately down to 2. Next slide, please. Now, although the hypothesis behind the technology integrated health management project at Surrey and Borders was keeping people out of hospital, I think the biggest finding really that's emerged from the project is the biggest benefit from that is probably for the carers. So that was the kind of, if you like, not what was designed to be shown from the study, but nonetheless carers who'd felt housebound themselves in looking after their loved one felt more confident to perhaps have some respite activity themselves or go to the supermarket because they knew they would get an alert if the monitoring showed a problem. And probably the unintended but most important output from that project is there's probably a delay in needing people with dementia to go into looked after accommodation, which again is very valuable to the family, very valuable to the person themselves, and also valuable from an economic point of view. So I thought I'd leave you some take-home messages, if that's all right. So I think ARCs, unlike perhaps university research, live and die on the implementation. So a lot of discovery within the ARC that it doesn't alter practice at all and doesn't have an impact on the lives of the people who are living with conditions and with needs and staff won't be highly rewarded or highly thought of within the ARC system. Spreading has always been difficult. That's why AHSNs were set up. That's why there is an ARC at all. And I think we have to understand that you can either incentivize people to take new things up. So you can either incentivize by rewarding them, like we did in the early days of our Enhancing Quality program, or by deferring the cost of something, which is also quite attractive to providers of services. And that's what some of the government initiatives do. In order to not miss the point, either within research or with innovation, I think there has to be a really good symbiotic relationship with the front line. So I really applaud the researchers within KSS ARC who go to that front line, who get those communities of experience and really make sure that the questions that they are going to spend time and money trying to answer are the questions that matter to the front line. I think that this creates pull from the front line. So people who've been involved in the early stages of setting a research question are interested in the findings. And part of our job to favour implementation is to keep that interest bubbling, whether it's from the public, who are an increasingly powerful lobby, whether it's from frontline social workers, nurses, doctors, allied health professionals, charities, or whether it's from the commissioners of service. And therefore, we need to have a system in Kent, Surrey and Sussex where we increase the interest in what the ARC is doing and the questions it's looking at and the timeline that those questions are going to be answered over. And all of that requires measurement. It doesn't require guessing. Qualitative statements and quantitative results are what people are used to looking at. And these are very important as a currency for implementation.